Hi, my name is Dr. Daniel Barnett. I'm from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And as part of the OHCQ Leadership Development Series, I'm going to be talking about a critical aspect of the work you do at OHCQ, which is delivering bad news. Specifically, in this case, delivering bad news in person. And I'm also going to be talking in this context about what we'll describe as the prepare, choose, present model. Communicating difficult news in any organization is a challenge, and communicating difficult news verbally is one of the biggest challenges. The model that I'm going to describe today, prepare, choose, and present, provides a structured yet effective approach based on the best available evidence to communicate what can be very challenging news verbally. I'd like to begin with some opening discussion questions. The first question is, what types of face-to-face discussions do you have in your work at OHCQ? The second discussion question for your consideration is, what types of difficult news do you need to convey in your verbal discussions at OHCQ? And when I say at OHCQ, that could include internal to OHCQ or external to OHCQ with regard to your stakeholders. Based on these discussion considerations, I'm going to now approach each of the elements of the prepare, choose, and present model in turn with respective tips for each. So let's begin with tips for prepare, in preparing communication of difficult news verbally. The first principle for preparing in this context is to warn in advance. If you expect negative news, give as much advance notice as you can to the recipient. Sometimes this is easier said than done, but avoiding surprise is ideal. So giving advance notice is very helpful. It improves uptake, receptivity to those difficult messages that are communicated verbally. If possible, give those with primary responsibility advance warning to allow them to help manage the conversations with colleagues or supervisors. There may be multiple conversations involved in this process. But again, the notice of advance warning, if you will, is a very valuable approach. The second principle is please don't hesitate. It's important to share bad news as soon as possible. You've heard the expression, nip something in the bud. Well, that's very important because sitting on bad news can allow a problem to expand. And the sooner one can deliver the bad news verbally, and the same is true respectively in writing for communicating bad news, it's important. So the sooner, the better. As mentioned in other presentations that I've described for this series, there's the principle of measuring twice and cutting once. Preparing for the conversation is important. What does this mean? How do you prepare for a conversation where you're delivering difficult news? Well, first of all, it's important for you to know all the facts of how the decision was made and if other possibilities were discussed. So having your ducks in a row as the deliverer of this difficult news in verbal communication is very important. And if you're not sure, please get the necessary information before you communicate this difficult news. By the way, that applies not just to verbal communication of difficult news, but to written communication of difficult news. Now, there's a fine line between planning and scripting a verbal message. So you don't want to sound stilted. You don't want to sound overly rehearsed. That will come across as insincere and will likely not be as well received by your audience. So how do we achieve that tightrope balance? Well, writing down key points or notes about what you want to say without necessarily creating a script is the nice balancing act that you want to achieve. If you create a script, first of all, you won't be able to follow it in most cases. And second of all, if you memorize a script, as I mentioned, it will come across exactly as that, a memorized script that will not feel empathetic to your audience. The next principle here is change your mindset. Try not to think about the immediate negative impact of a decision, but rather think about how it will improve the situation in the future. If you go into a conversation with a stakeholder where you're communicating difficult news verbally and your mindset is focused on how that communication will improve the situation in the future, it will likely result in a more constructive, solution-oriented conversation that will be better received by your audience. This may seem obvious and silly, but actually respiration is very important, not just in general, but in communicating difficult news verbally. So that means breathing normally. You may be under stress when communicating difficult news verbally. It's a stressful process to tell somebody something difficult that they may not want to hear. So breathing normally will allow you to keep an even keel as you communicate such messaging. And you may even want to practice your breathing before this conversation if necessary. So you can rehearse what you're going to say, but again, please avoid a scripted sounding verbal communication. But do practice breathing if that helps, so that you can be practiced and calm in delivering any difficult message. So let's think about some preparation discussion questions as we conclude our segment of this first step of the prepare, choose model. The first discussion question that I'd like to think about, or to have you think about, is what types of preparation do you do before a difficult discussion? That kind of self-reflection can be very helpful as we think about communicating difficult news verbally. The second discussion question that I'd like you to think about is, are there advantages to preparing versus quote-unquote winging it or doing it ad lib? So those kinds of considerations and discussion questions are very important. The next element of the model is to choose. So we've talked about prepare. Now we're going to talk about the choosing component. And there are 6 tips within this choose component when we think about how to communicate difficult news verbally. The first suggestion, the first tip, is to give an explanation. This means that the explanation of the difficult news should be given as briefly as possible. Please try, if possible, to resist the urge to explain too much to avoid going off message. This doesn't mean withholding information, but rather it avoids going too tangential in your communication. And thirdly, people are willing to accept an unfavorable outcome if they believe the decision-making process was sound. There's this concept called procedural fairness. And so communicating briefly, but highlighting what the rationale behind it was in a brief fashion is an important way to improve acceptance of what can be a difficult message in verbal communication. The next principle under choose is get to the core of the matter. The core message is obvious when you're giving bad news. It's the thing you don't want to say. Most people don't like to communicate bad news. Most people don't enjoy confrontation, or some people do, but most people don't. And inherently, when you're communicating difficult news in verbal communication, it can be a very uncomfortable experience for you as the communicator. But ironically, the message that you're avoiding or are most reticent to deliver is actually the very message that you need to deliver. So we'll talk about that. That's a long way of saying cut to the chase when you communicate difficult news verbally, but do so in a sensitive fashion, as we'll describe. Acknowledging your counterpart's perspective, the person to whom you're communicating, is very important to acknowledge. So this is a form of empathy, frankly, and it's important to not allow the relationship with the recipient of your communication to be broken through this process. Showing compassion for the goals of the person who's receiving the bad news is a critical piece of communicating difficult news verbally. Delivering bad news can strain an ongoing relationship just inherently. but the strain can be reduced by showing this empathy that I'm emphasizing here. Avoiding trigger words is another important principle under the choose component of the model. Please avoid saying it's policy. That comes across as very impersonal, brusque, and will typically fracture or fray a working relationship. So it's better to explain the reason behind a policy than to fall back on just restating the policy or to say it's policy. Always remind your listener of the bigger picture. So if the bad news ultimately will support their best interest, phrase it that way. Now there's a fine line between saying that and sounding patronizing, of course, but truly there is a best interest at hand and involved, and it's important to phrase it that way. Also focusing on the future. So one component of communicating difficult news verbally is that people are going to be focusing, your listener will be focusing on the immediate implications. But focusing on the future is an important component in communicating difficult news verbally because you want to discuss next steps to move on from that decision. And that also allows for enhanced cordiality in ongoing work relationships and stakeholder relationships. Helping to find an alternative is another tip. So if there is another alternative, don't hesitate to share it. Now, don't make up alternatives if there aren't any alternatives, but of course, if there is one, please be forthcoming. Offer options for moving forward. We want this to be constructive. As leaders at OHCQ, you want to optimize your relationships with your internal and external stakeholders in communicating difficult news in writing. So offering options for moving forward is a very constructive element of that. Always ask yourself before any difficult conversation if there's something that you can do to help the other party. Can you offer a quicker review of any follow-up documentation, for example? That's part of the measure twice, cut once approach before beginning this difficult conversation. Here are some brief content discussion questions regarding this element of the model. Can you think of any examples where a change in the content of a difficult message would make it easier to receive? Do you sometimes change the content of a negative message to fit your audience? Explain. Let's move to the next and final element of this model, which is to present. And there are 9 tips under present. This is a really critical piece of this prepare, choose, and present model. Each of these 3 pieces, the prepare, choose, and present, are vital, but this is really a critical one. Here are some suggestions under your presentation. Don't linger in the conversation. Address obvious questions, for example, but please don't get into speculation or extensive probing. That will lead you nowhere, and it will allow the audience to perhaps create confusion where confusion could have been avoided. Always try to control the pace at which you deliver the news. The cadence of it is important. Allow people to digest what they're hearing. Slow the pace of the conversation and pause before responding to any questions. This accomplishes 2 things. It allows you to think of a cogent response, and it diffuses potential tension that otherwise may be worsened. Importantly, though, stick to your guns. We want to be sensitive and empathetic to our audience when we communicate difficult news verbally, but keep in mind that this is not a negotiation. As an agency, your communications generally are not negotiable. So it's important to resist the urge to change your message based on pushback from your audience. Delivering bad news, frankly, is a lot like taking off a Band-Aid. It's best done quickly. The slow removal of a Band-Aid is actually harder. So doing it quickly but sensitively is very important. Once the news is delivered, please ask your audience for a reaction and listen to their concerns without changing the decision. That can be difficult because you're potentially opening yourself up to that pushback when you ask for those concerns, but it's important to ask for their concerns or questions because that shows empathy. It encourages very productive and constructive working relationship and enhances the uptake of your message. It's okay to allow people to vent their emotions. People may get emotional when they hear bad news, but it's okay to allow them to do that, but please maintain your composure in the process. That's absolutely critical, because otherwise, obviously, there can be an escalating spiral of emotionality that we want to avoid. Following up is critical for verbal communication about difficult news, just as it is for written communication about difficult news, as I've presented in a different module component. So following up when communicating difficult news verbally means offering support or empathy on an ongoing basis. So it's not just a one-time chat. It involves that follow-up process. And please kindly avoid delivering just bad news and then closing your door metaphorically or literally. It needs to be a process-based communication where there's follow-up and ongoing engagement. In-person delivery of difficult news when communicating difficult news verbally is better than over the phone. Showing up in person demonstrates your respect for your audience. And talking face-to-face, frankly, allows you to adjust according to the reactions of your audience, which you could not observe by phone, especially body language and facial expressions. So it allows you to be more empathetic. Now, sometimes you have no choice but to communicate difficult news over the phone versus in person, but whenever possible, talking face-to-face is better. Avoid repeating negative words. There's a principle that we discussed in another module component of this series where we talked about communicating difficult news in writing, and this principle is called negative dominance, where negative messages carry more weight in people's minds than positive messages. An illustrative example is you get 99 compliments and 1 insult. What do you remember longer? Of course, the 1 insult. Well, by repeating negative words in terms of the phrasing of your difficult news, that will only reinforce a negative message. So importantly, and whenever possible, try to turn a question with negative words from your recipient into a less negative response by using neutral or positive words. Always try to phrase things constructively in any conversation that you have, in other words. Please avoid saying no comment. That suggests that you have something to hide. If someone asks you a question in response to your delivery of verbal negative news and you say no comment, that completely will break any trust that communication recipient will have in you, and it will fracture your working relationship with that stakeholder, whether it's an internal stakeholder at OHCQ or an external stakeholder. Instead, you may want to try something more delicate as a phrasing such as "that's not appropriate to discuss," or similar phrasing. Please be direct and avoid mixed messages. Now, that directness and bluntness can be two different things, but importantly, you want to be direct, convey your message clearly, but be careful of your body language in doing so. This is true in any kind of interactive dialogue. Don't slouch or avoid eye contact. In most cultural contexts, maintaining eye contact is considered respectful, and so that should be something that you emphasize if you're communicating in person. Plus, it enhances trust in your listener. Also, consider rehearsing what you're going to say in advance in front of a mirror or even to a coworker. Now, that may sound like I'm contradicting earlier comments about avoiding sounding overly rehearsed, but you can rehearse without sounding scripted. So again, this will allow you to assess, are you breathing properly? Are you maintaining your poise without overly rehearsing it to the point of scriptedness. Importantly, a process of communicating difficult information is a process of reflection and learning. So after a difficult conversation, it can be helpful to reflect afterwards. What went well? What did not? So you can think about future approaches that you could take in subsequent conversations to optimizing the effectiveness of your communicating difficult news verbally. So I'd like to mention a few discussion questions regarding the presenting component of this model. One is, what else do you do when presenting difficult messages? Do you just convey the message itself, or what other kinds of activities do you do? The second discussion question in this context is it ever helpful to think of presenting difficult news as a performance for your audience? Now, When we think about performance, we think about acting, for example. That's not what this is, but in many ways it's a type of performance of your work role. And as leaders at OHCQ, this is something worth considering as a discussion item. Thank you very much, and I hope that this presentation has helped to provide practical guidance and insights into communicating difficult news verbally.